A very warm welcome and good evening for everyone who joining us on the webinar session. Thank you so much. This is the third discursive event of part of the event titled Point of Entry. The Point of Entry is the talk series for our exhibition titled Wartime Artists of Vietnam. And tonight you are here for a treat. We had a great honor to have Dr. Zhou Taomo, who joined us from NTU, University of NTU, Singapore. Dr. Zhou Taomo is an assistant professor at the Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. She specialized in modern China and Southeast Asia history. In particular, her teaching and research interests focusing on the nexus of geopolitics and migration in 20th century. Her writing has appeared in publications such as the China Quarterly and Critical Asia Study. Dr. Zhao's recent publication, Migration in the Time of Revolution, China, Indonesia, and Cold War, has received numerous press. It has been published last year, 2019, by Cornell University Press. The book argues that the migration and the political activism of the overseas Chinese were important historical focus in making of the governmental relationship between China and Indonesia during the Cold War. Tonight, through Dr. Zhao's presentation titled Print Culture and Journalism of Global South in the Cold War, we are going to learn about the history of AfroAsian Journalist Association, AAAJ Asia, especially the Asia's contribution to the discursive formation of the Third War. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Dr. Zhou Taomo.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Fangzi. Thank you all for joining us tonight. First, I'd like to thank Fangzi and Yuwen and Marianne for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here. So since this webinar series is called Points of Entry, I'd like to use the image in the poster for this event as the point of entry for my talk today. So entitled Vietnam-Indonesia Friendship, this woodcut is created in the year of 1965. 1965 is a fateful year. In Indochina, it marked the beginning of the transformation of the conflicts in Vietnam into an American war. In Indonesia, it was the killing season in which a nationwide anti-communist campaign led to the deaths of more than 500,000 people and the elimination of the world's third largest communist party, which is the Indonesian Communist Party. So beyond Southeast Asia, some of you might be familiar with the recent bestseller Vincent Bevan's Jakarta Method, which he shows that the mass killing in Indonesia had far-reaching impacts in countries in Latin America, such as Chile and Brazil. So 1965 was also a major turning point in 20th century world history. So as Yuwen wrote in her curator's note, our creation during times of war and mass violence is much more than frontline sketching, but endeavors to capture deeper human conditions, sagas of survival and despair, endurance and vulnerability. My focus today is a group of cosmopolitan intellectuals who live parallel lives with the wartime artists in Vietnam. They were members of the AfroAsian Journalist Association, which I'll call AAJ afterwards. So for those who are interested, this organization is featured prominently not only in the Jakarta Method, but also in Leila Chandoli's very beautiful historical novel, Pulang, or Home. So during the Cold War, okay, now it's working. Sorry, the clicker just rebelled. During the Cold War, the AJ fostered solidarity among journalists from formerly colonized nations. So it was established in 1963, and it organized international conferences, offered journalist training programs, and published its flagship English language magazine, which is called AfroAsian Journalist. However, the September 30th movement in Indonesia, 1965, and the ensuing mass murders shattered this organization. So its members were either persecuted in Indonesia or forced to flee abroad. In 1966, Jawato, the AJ's Secretary General, announced its relocation to China. From its new headquarters, the AJ continued its activities until its informal dissolution in 1974. So from Jakarta to Beijing, AJ's history is part of a larger story of transnational collaboration among newly independent countries during the Cold War. It originated from the 1955 AfroAsian Conference. Its relocation took place after the 1966 Tricontinental Conference, which expanded the realm of Afro-Asia collaboration to Latin America for the first time in history. And in 1974, the year of the AAJ's demise, the Chinese chairman Mao Zedong announced his theory of 3 worlds. So how did AAJ define, quote unquote, the third world differently at different times? What visions for third world solidarity did AAJ promote during its 11 years of history? And as part of a broader phenomenon of the global movement for social, racial, political, and economic justice among the formerly colonized nations, or what historian Vijay Prashad called the Third World Project, was the AAJ a rebellion against the Cold War or a product of the Cold War? To answer these questions, let's go back to Bandung, which laid the foundation for the AJ's cosmopolitan outlook in its early years. So characterized by commercial awareness, cultural pluralism, and artistic vibrancy. At the Bandung conference, the Third World made its debut on the international stage. In addition to its political significance, Bandung is also one of the few international diplomatic conferences that had entered mass popular culture across continents. The mushrooming mass media in the early post-World War II era helped bring this event to ordinary people in post-colonial states. So beyond the gathering of third world elites, journalists from various background gather and mingle at Bandung. For instance, as you can see from the image here, the renowned African-American writer Richard White attended the conference as a freelance reporter and exchanged ideas of some of Indonesia's leading intellectuals. So encounters among journalists at Bandung and their shared dissatisfaction with Western media gave rise to the idea of building a global alliance of reporters across the third world. So the major event that inspired the AJ's internationalism were the political upheavals in Congo. The assassination of the charismatic leader Patrice Lumumba in 1961 was a common reference point for third world left-wing forces fury toward superpower intervention in the process of decolonization. In Indonesia, the political unrest in Congo had special symbolic meaning. Between 1960 and 1963, Indonesian soldiers completed 2 missions in Congo as UN peacekeepers. So in 1961, shortly after Lumumba's death, LECRA, the Institute for the People's Culture affiliated with the Indonesian Communist Party, published a collection of poems entitled "We Are All Lumumba." The magazine AfroAsian Journalist was printed and distributed by the Lumumba Foundation in Jakarta. The logo of the Lumumba Foundation, as you can see in the slide here, which depicted a pen and flaming fires, routinely appear on the back of the AfroAsia Journalist magazine. So the AJA declared that its mission was to challenge the hegemony of capitalist and imperialist presses in formerly colonized countries. While the AAJ disapproved the contents of capitalist presses, it valued its professional practices as something to be emulated by revolutionary journalists. The mission of the AfroAsian Journalist was to, quote unquote, make the masses better informed and more skillful in their approach to life. However, a Dao style was not to be associated with the seriousness of the object. Third world journalists had to make their publication attractive to the eye and easy to handle by the hand. The ultimate goal was to elevate revolution journalism to the level of art, which would bring its audience not just political awareness, but also a pleasurable escape from the daily burden of work. The AJ's leader recognized the challenge faced by them is not just competition against Western presses, but also the low literacy rate of their target audience, the working class. Visual art could convey ideas and emotions in a way that did not require as much effort and education on the part of the audience. So a key feature of AfroAsian Journalist, the magazine, was its extensive use of images, which include both photos and political characters. So here we see an essay on the right-hand side of the slide, essay written by Sibarani, a renowned Indonesian artist, entitled Character in Journalism. So Sibarani established his reputation as the editorial cartoonist for the leftist daily Bintang Timur or East Star. So in his word, humor is a tremendously effective political weapon. Okay, so next, here you see this is the signature center spread of the magazine AfroAsian Journalist. Basically, the strategy is to juxtapose images of military resistance against imperialism in different parts of the world. So this design encouraged the readers to visualize political solidarity among spatially distant events. Reports are selected to form a unified narrative of shared themes, creating an image of robust transnational information flow center of common struggle. So here, this center spread is entitled One People, One Struggle, One Enemy. It's drawn from a 1964 issue of AfroAsian Journalist magazine. And here you see images of militant resistance against colonialism, imperialism, and new colonialism from places such as Angola, Malaysia, South Africa, Cuba, and of course, Vietnam. Moving up next, this is another center spread, which you can see quite different from the previous one. It consists completely of characters. And as you can sense, this also kind of reflect a radicalization of Indonesian foreign policy. So by around 1964, Sukarno's crusade against what he called new colonialism, imperialism, took increasing precedence over his role as a non-aligned mediator of the Cold War. So in this life and death struggle between new emerging forces and old established forces, two terms he coined, the AfroAsia press, in Sukarno's words, was the pen mightier than the sword. So here, this is another section of the center spread. It's called Martyrdom and Resurrection in Asia and Africa. So for the journalists working for the AfroAsian Journalist Association, the Congo crisis symbolized introduction of Cold War, so which they understood as the superpowers contestation of for power and influence, and they force this idea to the people in Asia, Africa. So in other words, they use the Cold War in lower cases, which means this is an external force that could cause Asian African countries to deviate from their design paths of development. So in other words, by introducing the idea of Cold War, they kind of hijacked the local political discourse, and the imperial powers sought to erode the revolutionary solidarity among people of Asia, Africa, by engaging them in irrelevant domestic or international conflicts and distracting them from their goal of achieving independence. Okay, so as mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the mid-1960s was a turning point in modern Indonesia, in the AfroAsian movement, and also in the global Cold War. So in 1965, mass violence enveloped Indonesia, and Suharto deposed Sukarno. Sukarno's downfall was a blow to the Afro-Asia solidarity movement, which had already suffered a loss of leading figures such as U Nu of Burma. He was placed under house arrest in 1962. Nehru of India died in 1964. And then coup d'etat in Algeria in 1965 removed Bembela. And then another one in 1965 in Ghana removed Nkrumah. So meanwhile, the division also deepened between Afro-Asian countries which want to pursue peaceful coexistence within the existing structure of the Cold War, and those demanded a radical reconfiguration of world order through force. So here we come to 1966, the Tricontinental Conference held in Havana. So this is a major gathering of representatives from countries that regarded revolutionary violence as a just form of resistance. The host of the Tricontinental Conference, as you can see from the slide, is Fidel Castro. And Castro at the time was very much frustrated with Soviet Union's peace initiatives. He asserted that the genuine solidarity of the Third World meant concrete military solution for countries combating colonialism and imperialism, such as Vietnam. The Tricontinental Conference was also the first international opportunity for the Indonesian left wing to voice its opposition to the anti-communist dictatorship led by Suharto. So here you see the image of Isa Ibrahim. He was the head of the Indonesian Organization for the Afro-Asia People's Solidarity. So in 1966, he led a delegation representing Sukarno's disposed government at the Tricontinental Conference in Havana. And after the conference, he and his fellow delegates were offered asylum in China. And in Beijing, between 1966 and 1971, the AAJ became the People's Republic of China's propaganda machine, featuring a very rigid reporting format, following the Cultural Revolution propaganda tropes, basically to accentuate the image of Mao Zedong as a world revolutionary leader. So convinced that China was in the eye of a worldwide revolutionary storm, Mao Zedong ordered Chinese journalists to quote unquote take charge of the entire globe. In 1967, Mu Guangren, the former editor-in-chief of the official New China News Agency, he paid a visit to Jawato. And he went there to try to persuade Jawato to accept Mao Zedong thought as the guiding principle of AAJA. Jawato initially was very reluctant, as he believed that doing so would undermine the AAJ's commitment to serving journalists from countries with different ideology and different political systems. In the end, as an exile living under Beijing's patronage, Jawato had little recourse. The AAJA passed a resolution recognizing Mao Zedong's thought as its guiding principle, which Jawato praised in public as more powerful than atomic bomb. Events organized by the AAJ became laden with cultural revolution rituals, such as you can see here, chanting of political slogan, reading of Little Red Book, quotation of Chairman Mao Zedong. And here you see an image. This is the AAJ's Day celebration in 1967. So the after conference entertainment include the singing of the song, "The People of Asia, Africa, Latin America Want Liberation," a dance performance entitled "The People of the World Love Chairman Mao," and the opera entitled "Down with China's Khrushchev," and thoroughly criticized and repudiated him. And in the picture, you see Jawato, the Secretary General of AAJ, shaking hands with the performers. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the AAJ's outreach programs, particularly its journalism training course, also became a tool to showcase the supposed global support for China's Cultural Revolution. So the first AAJ journalism course, which was held in 1965 before the September 30th movement, actually took its 11 students from countries such as Africa, from 8 different countries to Indonesia, China, and Vietnam. So besides emphasizing the importance of ideology, the course actually covered photography, newspaper design and layout, editing, news analysis, and the basics of broadcasting. So the students were taught that these techniques, together with a creative artistic taste and a strong organizational ability, were indispensable for producing a good, popular, and dignified revolutionary press. Yet, professional training barely appeared in the course that followed, held in China during the Cultural Revolution. So basically, you see here, Javato was distributing the Little Red Book and the Mount badges to the students, and he declared that journalism course should concentrate on Mao Zedong thought, and students were taken to tours to Mao's native town in Shaoshan, which was like the secret revolution base in Yan'an. So here you see the center spread, again, featuring the third journalist course of the AAJA. Basically include 15 students from countries such as Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Ceylon, and Indonesia. And they were studying Mao's work. They were harvesting sugar cane in Guangdong, and they were learning to dance Long Live Chairman Mao with the Red Guards. Remember, we saw earlier that during the Jakarta period, the AAJ promoted the use of caricature as a tool to increase the marketability of revolutionary media. This continued after it moved to Beijing for domestic political mobilization and also for propaganda abroad. In November 1966, AAJ organized AfroAsian Anti-Imperialist character exhibition in Beijing, which attracted allegedly over 1 million visitors, hailed as a milestone in the history of the creation of anti-imperialist cartoons in Asia, Africa. The display included more than 180 cartoons by artists from countries such as Vietnam, Congo, and Algeria, and Angola. So in 1967, the AAJ published a collection of Afro-Asia people's anti-imperialist characters with introductions and captions in 4 different languages, which are English, French, Arabic, and Chinese, and distributed in the Middle East and Africa as Cultural Revolution propaganda material. So in its last 2 years, due to the reorientation of Chinese foreign policy following the Sino-US rapprochement, the AAJ redirected its emphasis from militant anti-imperialism to economic development. Following the political shifts in China in the early 1970s, the trans networks previously forged by the AAJ in the name of anti-imperialism became the platform that facilitated the migration of Indonesian left-wing journalists who sought exiles in the PRC to capitalist West. So the exiles were technically stateless when their Indonesian passports expires and faced many obstacles and restrictions. So after much research and deliberation, Indonesian journalist Umar Said, whose image you can see from the slide, he basically DIY'd. So he extended his old passport by using a fake stamp. And in 1973, with this DIY self-extended passport, he took an experimental trip to Western Europe and basically to conduct a survey to see where is the best environment for him to migrate. And the following year, he settled in Paris, France, where he opened an Indonesian restaurant. Okay, so this is the last slide of my presentation. Tracing the changes in AAJ demonstrate the complex and often conflicted ways in which 2 major actors in the Third War project, Indonesia and China, conceptualized the Third War and formulated media representations during the Cold War. As the most important global alliance of journalists in the formerly colonized world, the AAJ was a multilingual, multicultural, and multifaceted organization. Like the Vietnamese wartime artists, the journalists of the Global South also tried to negotiate with what Yun Wen called the whirlwind of ideology and state-initiated prescriptives aesthetic approach. So the words and artwork they created are testimonies of the expansive global information networks, lively intellectual traffic, and the rich visual arts of Afro-Asian nations. However, the AJ's history also reflects the fragility endemic to transnational non-governmental organizations during the Cold War and the heterogeneity of a conglomerate of different peoples with different paths and vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao, for your wonderful presentation. Fascinating to go through this extremely dynamic, I think, international history. However, the waves of, I think, this very unique AfroAsian Afro-Journalism Association, how does that, not only as an international diplomacy, but also it is also the domestic politics manifested through the different stage. However, I'm very curious about both your research method in a sense also on the reception in a sense of those the circulation of the publication itself, because it's as Jawada mentioned, there's a very unique emphasis on the accessibility of the publication itself.
Right.
So would you mind share a little bit about while you're doing this research, as mentioned in your book, you will not only you utilize the kind of bilingual archival resources, but also uniquely you had a chance to conduct various interviews. So will you mind share a little bit on how the reception ends, how readers respond to those various publications and how they envision the kind of third worldism in the reading, reception, and of the publication. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for your question, Franz. That's an excellent question. I think that also echoes this question from the audience. What was the extent of distribution of the AJA journal? It's quite interesting. When I was trying to collect all these publications, I found them at least in 4 different places. The ISIS Library in Singapore, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, and surprisingly, Tulane University. It has a very good Africana Studies Center, and they have the whole collection of. So I guess it's because AJ had a very strong emphasis on solidarity with the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. So kind of speaks to our current moment of very contentious discussion about racial relations. And going back to the question of reception and circulation, we're talking about this earlier. I think now more and more people are using the code word to describe what is happening now. And for all of us, code word wasn't a reality, I guess, until it's debatable, right? When did Cold War become a reality, right? So in our colleague Hajimu's work, he argued that it didn't become a reality until after the Korean War. But for these intellectuals, perhaps it didn't become a reality after 1965, right? Before that, there was still plenty of room for them to maneuver. Like they could be simultaneously Western educated, well-versed in classical European literature, multilingual, but at the same time left-leaning. And they wouldn't easily identify with either the Soviet Union or the United States. So I would say like that's still an age of fluidity and flexibility, and also for individual intellectuals to act beyond or beneath the nation state. Yeah, and in the book, I guess I touch more something I wouldn't have the time to talk about is about the migrants. Now marketing the book. So the book also shows that before 1965, there was also still room for individual migrants to have multiple identities and multiple political belongings.
Yeah. Completely. We do have some questions coming from the audiences. Thank you so much. There's a fascinating long question right here. Let me just read it out loud so all our participants can get a sense. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. I agree as well. Was the AAJA establishment the symbol of resilience, and did it also nurture the same spirit as the former colonist country throughout transnational platform? And how about with communist Indonesia interest on it, especially around 1960, which was the most crucial moment in internal affair dynamic in Indonesia? As we understand, communist Indonesia was one of the biggest communist party in Asia or even the world. What was their interest on AJ? Thank you.
Oh, that's a very loaded. Yeah, it's a good question. It's also a very loaded question. So just to be accurate, I think the Communist Party of Indonesia was the third largest. It's eldest Communist Party in Asia, even established even before the Chinese Communist Party. It's actually the largest non-ruling Communist Party of the world. I think there had always been suspicions that, I guess the same question was the wartime artists in Vietnam under Yunwen's study, like whether they are just agents of propaganda of the communist regime, right? How much leverage, how much room of maneuvering do they have beyond this almost homogenizing power of the communist ideology? For me, I think there was this brave moment before 1965 that they can voice that there is this space for intellectual freedom, although this space narrowed down ultimately, I think, and especially after AJ moved to Beijing. And the later part of the story, I think, is something nowadays lots of the literature on Afro-Asia studies, Afro-Asian movement didn't want to talk about because there is a kind of romanticization or nostalgia about this beautiful Afro-Asian world. But I think it's also critical for scholars to see like why did the Afro-Asian movement fail and what were the structure causes for its fragility. Oh,
right, wonderful. Gregory, thank you so much. There's a question from our audiences. Were the cartoons written in another language too?
That's a good question. I think many of the cartoons are very similar to the cartoons in Harian Rakyat, which is the People's Daily, the organ of the Indonesian Communist Party. So those cartoons, some of them I think are in Bahasa Indonesia, but in AfroAsian Journalist, they translate it back to English. Yeah, but it's a very good question because the booklet, the collection of anti-imperialist caricature, it's actually in 4 languages, and it's very it has a very savvy kind of international marketing strategy.
Right. Thank you for there's another question coming from our audiences in relation to the distribution of AJ and the international outreach events that the journal organized. Were the local chapters of AJ active, and if any, were particularly influential in the political of certain countries?
Certain countries. That's also a very good question. I think to my knowledge, I think most of the outreach tours were directed to Africa, particularly the North African countries. But I don't see any substantial link or kind of the interconnected events between AAJ and domestic events in other countries. I think the most significant one is still the 1965 mass killings and political turmoil in Indonesia. Actually, if you're interested, the opening scene in Leila Chanduri's home is about AJ. It's about the capture of a branch leader in the darkroom of his photo studio. So he transformed his skills into like a, portray, basically a commercial portrait studio after AAJA was basically, I would say, banned by the Suharto government.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful round of question and answer. Thank you so much again, Dr. Tamo, for this fascinating, I think, history about both the publication readership and the reception of the third worldism. Now we shift the gear to our own exhibition, Wartime Artists of Vietnam. It's a wonderful to have our curator, Song Yun-Wen, going to share a little bit more, in a sense, a portrayal of third worldism in the collection. So Yun-Wen, thank you so much for joining us today. So I think we will already present some of the works, and Yun-Wen will guide us through to present the individual nuances of this presentation of the kind of cosmopolitan third worldism in the pictorial sense. Thank you, Yun-Wen.
Thank you, Fancy. Thank you, Tamo, for such a wonderful talk. Before I introduce these artworks, I would like to point out during the American War, some of the Vietnamese artist soldiers served as war correspondents. They swiftly depict the scene on the spot with pencil or a pen on paper, and later touch up the work with gouache or watercolor after returning to their military bases. So many of their drawings function as reportage images and would be sent back to Hanoi to be featured in the military journals and newspapers. So some of the artist soldiers like Huỳnh Văn Thoại had experience of working at the education and propaganda unit in the North Vietnamese army. They were known for their colorful propaganda posters delivering the Hanoi government's political and ideological messages. Here we have two posters from Huỳnh Văn Thoại, the first one and second one, and the images on my left. Okay, Huỳnh Văn Thoại was born in Saigon in 1921 and graduated from the Indochina College of Fine Arts in Hanoi in 1944. So this in this poster, you can see it vividly depicts a French soldier falling into flames, as well as the flags of Algeria and Vietnam, showing the strong relations between these two countries. And the inscriptions around the poster say, "The heroic resistant spirit of the people of Algeria is forever." And the unity between the people of Vietnam and Algeria is forever. So regarding the subject of this image, I would like to share with our audience the story about the French Frontline journalist, Madeleine Heifer, who supported anti-colonial resistance during and after the World War II. She was one of the first French journalists to report on her country's use of torture in Algeria. Her report in 1952 says, "The Algerians were being tortured. For me, it was unbearable to know that my own country was doing that." Since then, she had made several visits to Algeria and covered their war of independence. So after the Algerian War, she went to Vietnam as a war correspondent and had lived for several years with the Viet Cong fighting the Americans. She caused a stir in Vietnam because of her romance with Nguyen Đình Thi, a very talented poet and intellectual who then became the Minister of Culture in North Vietnam. So they met each other in Berlin. Imagine the scenario. In 1951, it was a 50-year-long romance, and Nguyen Đình Thi wrote many poems dedicated to this lady throughout his life. So his famous lines, for example, "I love you as I love our country, in pain, hardship, and with great passion. We will fight all our lives for our love. We love each other and we are proud to be human. So in this specific context involving the Cold War and the AfroAsian Alliance, we can see the entangling relations and encounters between countries and peoples at many levels. So the second poster was also done by Huỳnh Văn Thoại. The meaning of the words at the bottom of the image is Cuba for the Cuban people. So this poster was made in July of 1961 after the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of the same year. So this invasion was a failed attack by a group of Cuban exiles who were trained and financed by the CIA to push the Cuban leader Castro from power. So its aftermath was, of course, the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So in the face of a common enemy, namely the United States, the friendship between Cuba and Vietnam grew stronger. And the fact is that after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro envisioned this tricontinental world, right, made up of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So after the 1955 Bandung conference, the anti-colonial struggles somehow merged with the resistance against the US imperialism. So all the movements associated with these two forms of struggles were brought together at the 1966 Havana Tricontinental Conference. I think Tao Mo would know more about this than I do. So basically, this framework of tricontinentalism created the foundation of what would be called the global South. Yeah, so in the wake of the Cold War. And the common goal of these countries in the tricontinental is to stand in solidarity against the powers of the global North. So after the reunifications of the two Vietnams in 1975, quite a few Vietnamese wartime artists had the opportunity to visit and to exhibit their works in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Cuba. So it shows Vietnam's close relationships with their communist nation, with other communist nations during the 1970s and 1980s. I would like to mention that last year, London's House of Illustration organized an exhibition showcasing a large collection of Cuban graphics related to the Cold War. So the period of 1965 and 1992 saw the golden age of Cuban poster design. Most of the posters were produced by Castro's Organization of Solidarity of the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this organization was established in Havana in 1966, right after the first Tricontinental Conference. So like the Vietnamese propaganda posters, those Cuban posters were designed with the purpose of uniting liberation struggles all over the world. It might be an interesting project if we have the chance to compare and analyze the revolutionary posters from different tricontinental countries at that time and explore their interconnections. Here we also have three cartoon-style propaganda illustrations by the artist Dai Tu. These illustrations were actually the drafts for posters. They were made in the early 1960s before the passing of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in August 1964. So however, the subject matters depicted here already demonstrate the intensity of potential conflict between North Vietnam and USA, even though these images to some extent do show a good sense of humor. Okay, so the first one, I think on the audience left. Okay, this illustration depicts American imperialists helping the lackeys of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam at that time. So the inscriptions actually are covered at the bottom. And the inscriptions say, Americans help Diem much more. Diem collapses more, dragging the American boss with him. And the second one at the center depicts has three caricatures condemning the Americans and the South Vietnamese government. And the inscriptions here say, from left to right, who curses the Buddha and hurts the monks will be damned by the thunder. That's the one on the left. And the central one, who poisons the people will be boiled by hot oil before falling into hell. And the one on the right, who kills the people will be stabbed by the spike before falling into hell. And the illustration, the third one, is a triptych of anti-American caricatures. Yeah. Okay, next. So in this collection, yes, it's also shown in Thao Mo's slides. Here we have a woodcut print image made in 1965 by Chen Wanken, showing the friendship between North Vietnam and Indonesia. So the formal ties between Vietnam and Indonesia were established after the 1955 Bandung Conference. Indonesia established consulate generals in Hanoi and in Saigon, respectively. Ho Chi Minh visited Indonesia in 1959, and Sukarno returned the visit soon after. So the Sukarno regime grew to favor North Vietnam and decided to establish an embassy in Saigon in August 1964. Saigon immediately closed its consulate general office in Jakarta and called the Indonesian decision a serious breach in friendship. Okay, so however, this honeymoon period between North Vietnam and Indonesia didn't last long. So Indonesia adjusted its foreign policy due to the fall of Sukarno, of course, and the rise of the anti-communist Suharto government. But it's important to note that the Jakarta-Hanoi diplomatic ties were still maintained during the Suharto era, despite the suspension of relations between Jakarta and Beijing after October 1967. Okay. So last year, there was a new book published by Professor John Curley. The book title is Global Art and Cold War. He examines the role that images played in the Cold War. He suggests that we should think about what the Cold War can teach us about how art shapes politics and vice versa. So he considers the Cold War as a way of seeing the world. Of course, in most of the cases at that time, a world divided into two distinct camps, Soviet communism versus American capitalism. However, he also points out local situations need specific understandings. For example, many North Vietnamese soldiers were fighting for national independence or a self-determination, not for ideological reasons. In other words, anti-colonial and anti-imperialist sentiments on a personal level cannot be equated with the Cold War ideologies. So for me, I think the major issue here is that our visual training and political ideology may dictate the way we look at these images. This involves the idea of interpretive community or communities of response, considering the plurality of ways viewers interpret and approach images. So in this sense, the meaning and identity of these images are fluid and flexible. Professor John Curley further suggests that while these images served ideological purposes, we as viewers may need to look at this form of art with a sideways glance. Yeah. Okay, so my introduction ends here.
Thank you, Yun. That was fascinating. I think it's an extremely interesting moment when we juxtapose the earlier presentation from Dr. Tomo on the kind of journalistic approach to the so-called, nowadays we will phrase both journalism, news coverage, writers, and both the painter from Vietnam as creative labor. I think there's a sense of self-fulfillment of all the creative people in the creative industry will have to address why we always work overtime all the time. I think that's something we can definitely resonate with this generation of unique experiences of being a creative labor during the hype of the Cold War era. I think maybe one day we can also think about how that depiction of the third worldism through this sense of self-fulfillment and sense of autonomy, right? Individual autonomy as well, expressed through the medium creativity has also to do with the portrayal or writing of the third worldism. I mean, definitely full of passion as well. We do have one question from all our audiences. Which media did the artist of the Cuban poster work with? Was the art style on the left common in propaganda poster of the time?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Of course, we have the information here. So this poster is the mixed media hand-painted poster. But I think it's a study for the posters. It's not a final product. However, the artist Huỳnh Văn Thuở was a very well-trained artist. He really had a very solid foundation of sketching. He was very well trained by the French and also in the College of Indochina Fine Arts. So I think, and maybe for each artist, even though of course the messages are political, they do have their own individual styles and skills when they create those posters. Yeah, so you can still see, the differences between their styles.
A wonderful question, which I also would love to ask. Thank you.
Professor.
What exactly it meant by quote unquote sideway glance?
It means it's not a direct glance. It's not a direct look, but as a viewer, you can try to be, try your best to be neutral, and not that your view or your way of looking influenced by your ideologies. Yes. I think it's a very ethical and a responsible way when you look at a piece of artwork. Even though, yeah, definitely people have different, views on certain topics and on certain subjects. But I think this is a question that can be discussed among us. Like Fangzi, what do you think? Since you are also a curator and art critic, yeah, how to view objects and images? What's the best way to look at arts? Yes, it's always a long-lasting debate.
No, I think it's truly a wonderful question because we are really trying to interpret this particular. I think a genuine phrase, sideway glance. It's also about the positioning of the viewer, right? It's also about the position of the viewer. It also is quite empowerment comments on the so-called propaganda arts during the Cold War era. I mean, so-called this particular quote-unquote art, it's they inhabit in this unique media is compared with the painting in our back. This is not reproducible. However, the so-called poster cartoon is a reproducible during the machinery production type of art. So I think somewhere we need to also think about the notion of, I think, encoding, decoding. I mean, absolutely, the media organization, which is the ASIA or Vietnamese government, have absolutely right to encode messages to, visual media or writing. However, as readers of the painting or the artwork, they have absolutely autonomy to take position, right? Whether you choose the dominant position to agree and then be moved and be mobilized by the work of art, or usually in most media reception cases is a neutral position, which means they negotiate with the message convey through the particular media or the particular images, but at the same time there's a possibility someone take the oppositional position, right? Yes. So I think that's the beauty of art we're discussing here, regardless it's a writing media or images. They have that openness, allow us to step into and further to have this conversation, to think about what's the potentialities right here. Say we are now presenting them in a very different context inside the gallery space, right? As a curator, what kind of narrative, right? You are also decoding and encoding it for particular messages you want to convey, right? In one, I think for the curator, none of us have a neutral position when we are responding to a work of art, right? I mean, I would love to read the full passage, but with the limitation of the accessibility to the context, this is my interpretation. Yeah.
I think in the introduction of that book, his point is to suggest that, especially for Cold War art, just try to avoid being influenced by this ideological blindness, or influenced by this binary rhetoric. Yeah, and just to try to find our own ways to interpret these images or objects.
So we have another wonderful question from our audiences. In relation to the poster about Algeria and Cuba, how extensive was the knowledge of the population about what was happening outside the local? Was it motivated more by emotion or by a present underlying context?
Actually, I'm also curious about this issue, but then maybe Taumo can help me answer this question. Like how was the information distributed? Among these countries at that time. As far as I know, of course, North Vietnam, the government had its own military newsletters in English. And they sent all these publications and newsletters to different corners of the world. But exactly how, for example, how these soldiers received the news and the information from the outside world, and also how they communicated with each other, like in different countries. I think that's something I found quite fascinating. Or maybe radio. Yes.
I think this is another question about another issue about people, like how would these art reach to the ordinary people, to everyday people? For me, I think it's really hard. I think that's one of the fatal defects of AJA. In my knowledge, they still remain a very exclusive literati intellectual circle, and there is no. Maybe I'm being very pragmatic, being the stereotypical pragmatic, cold-hearted, Cold War historian here. There's no foundation for ordinary people to imagine a workable solidarity with people far away from them. right? Like
it's like an abstract idea for them to
exactly. It's abstract.
understand.
It's a very romantic, alluring project, but I feel like there wasn't really a substantial infrastructure to support it.
For example, I think that on the everyday level, they had to deal with the issues of survival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, while I'm reading, yeah, I mean, while I'm reading your wonderful presentation and thinking about your book in context with, I think, our upbringing from the free face of China. I mean, of course, I passed that. Yeah, I mean, I passed that age. I'm not that old, to be honest, but I think because my research, I'm very fascinating also by the print media during the Cold War era, especially in Hong Kong, Taiwan. The two major print media was quite dominant. There's Free China, 自由中国. Then you also have the War Now, the 今日世界. I think in China it's called 今日世界. Both publication, they're really cheap. They are really cheap. I think that's also why it was circulated extremely well. I remember I found a copy in my dad's recycling bin because, you know, I mean, the cover was a lovely woman. I think that's also another reason. The objectification of the woman was heavily infused to portray a kind of liberal expression of woman's body. I think that's another interesting thing. Maybe we can also have this conversation because I think both side of the ideological struggle, regardless you're coming from left or right, we're very much talking about the portrayal of women is very much a lot in print media, in photos. So I'm quite curious from both your perspective while you're working with this fascinating material from regardless of Talmud or regardless when we do have a lot of portrayal of female, almost as a visual trope. However, I don't really see the lived experiences as a female to really feel the lived experiences via those visual languages. So I'm quite curious about your thoughts. I mean, both of you, of the female working with the material. What's your thoughts on the portrayal of another coded material, which is female body in those media presentation? Yeah.
So I was talking with Francis earlier. So the the AJ is a many layered story. The bigger, the kind of on in written formal format is the story I presented. There's another hidden story behind it, which I'm still trying to write, which is the story of a woman called Francisca Fondije. So you don't see her a lot. She's not a well-known person, but she was a very active multilingual journalist working for the AAJ, and she spent 20 years in exile in China. And at that point, she left behind 7 children in Indonesia. So when September 30th movement happened, she was in Algeria attending a conference. And her eldest daughter told her what happened. Her husband was arrested. Her children were all scattered around fleeing from persecution. And she was, during her time in China, she wasn't really suffering from persecution. However, the fervor of Cultural Revolution really caused a mental casualty on her. And it's telling on each of her 7 children's birthday, she wrote in her diary a birthday gift in the form of a revolutionary youth story to her child, knowing that they would never read it because there is no communication. And the trope on the official line is that an ideal citizen is a sacrificing mother like Francisca Fondije. But they do pay a hidden price, which is really like emotional and deeply personal. So in the case of Francisca Fondije, all her children grew up to be really well. However, the ties couldn't be rebuilt due to her 20 years of absence. So in the end, she didn't really reunite with her family, and she passed away by herself in the Netherlands. Yeah.
I think for this exhibition, the problem is that as a curator, we have to deal with the images from this collection, yeah, collected by Dato Palameswalam. As far as I know, there were some female artist soldiers in North Vietnam. So imagine if we can somehow retrieve or look at their artworks, maybe we can get a different picture of what they have been through during the war years. Yeah. So yeah, so there is how do I say that? A lot of subjects we can explore further. Yeah. For example, the role of female artist soldiers in North Vietnam or in the Vietnamese army. Yeah.
We do have a final question from our audiences. Despite the poster has an underlying motif of regard to propaganda / national objectives, at the end of the day, those are still artwork, subject to the creator's own subjectivity, intersectionality, etc., etc., which affect the creative processes. Do you think the creator ever reconciled within themselves the conflict between self-expression versus staying in line with what was expected of them to create? Were there repercussions if they produce something quote unquote out of line?
Yes, interesting question, but welcome back. Just come back to our the webinar this Thursday, because my gallery tour will definitely answer this question. Yeah.
So for these audiences, you better join us on Thursday, okay? Sorry, do we still have questions there? We still have one more question. Okay. Yeah, so for all the audiences who haven't registered, if you haven't registered the upcoming webinar, please make sure you join us, because Ringwon will give us more insight on the collection and exhibition. We do have a wonderful question again from our very own Sid Parrots. Can you speak more about the other ways of these images were circulated? With the earlier speaker, those were images that end up in AJ, and I assume the images were made for them. How about the other works, drawings, sketches, paintings? What else did they find circulation in? How vulnerable do you think artists were being co-opted by political ideology during this period of the Vietnam War and the Cold War? Meaning, would your research draw on the expression of an artist's autonomy outside the making of those painting drawings? I'm asking this in relation to the practice we are drawn to right now, where artists perform different personalities as a way to express autonomy with the outside their work. How about then, and with the authors operating within the terrain of ideology war? Excellent question. Thank you, Sid.
Is this question for me? Hello, Sid. Again, definitely this question will be covered in my gallery tour. But yeah, I think different artist soldiers suffer from different issues. Because I think that the categories, their identities somehow were also different. Some of them were actually journalists, as I mentioned before, were correspondents. So it's really their job to deliver what they saw, I mean, from the perspectives of the North Vietnamese army and the government. But some of them were were artists before they joined the army. And the reason why they joined the army, because that's also the way to survive. Otherwise, they couldn't have any platform to showcase their art. So their focus, their purpose was solely on their art. So after after going through all these war years, they might have a different thought about what they have been through. Yeah.
So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you both speaker, Dr. Zhou Taomo and our very own Yunwen, to join us this evening. And thank you all for joining us, spending 2 hours here with us to listening through for all this wonderful story. We do hope it has been an illuminating session for you. We also thank Dr. Zhou Taomo once again being here, make it all the way here.
Thank you so much.
This is an amazing talk. I'm so enlightened. Yeah. To join us again on Thursday for our talk by Dr. Claudine on landscape poetry from the Mekong Delta in the 18th century. Yes, we time travel back, and it's a very interesting picture of the kind of landscape we're going to discuss also in our exhibition as well. We hope you enjoyed tonight. Join us again. I'm looking forward to see you all on Thursday evening with Dr. Claudine On's wonderful presentation upcoming. Have a great night ahead, and thank you so much.